Hello, and welcome to this podcast series, Saints, Olympians of Our Faith, illustrating the beauty of the Universal Church. I'm your host, Cristero War. In today's episode, Jesús Padrón is with us to discuss Team Mexico's star saints and Mexican Catholic identity. Welcome, Jesus.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
We're here in person, which is nice. This is different. I haven't done this before.
It's a change, right? The pandemic sometimes puts us very close confines, and being able to speak like this, I really appreciate it.
Shout out to my coworker Cameron for making sure this setup would be great for us.
Shout out Cameron. Thank you.
AV guy here at the parish. I'm really excited about today's episode. I probably threw you off when I asked you to be a part of this podcast series.
A little bit. I wasn't expecting it, but to be honest, it was something that I had in my heart. God likes to have his fun with us sometimes. He has these desires and expectations, but at the end of the day, what he wants for us is to love him. And if it's this way, if it's being recorded, not being recorded, you want to try to give glory to God. We
got to know each other better at the National Eucharistic Congress and traveling together. But of course, here at the Newman Center and being in choir, I'm excited to hear what you have to share. So first off, do you want to just introduce yourself to the listeners?
I appreciate you in your pronunciation, Jesús Padrón. I love it. Something as simple as a name. Siobhan, with that interview, she talked a lot about the name, right? Olympia. I didn't know any of that, but it says so much. I have a middle name, Jesus Alberto, and it's more common in Mexico and a lot of Hispanic cultures to have several last names. I like including my mother's last name, Jesus Alberto Padrón Esparza. And I think it's because we appreciate where we come from, not just our lineage, but our family. And I think that's something where we can easily start off. A lot of how I identify in my own faith was always together with family. That has its upsides and downsides. Its upsides will definitely you getting introduced to a very beautiful thing. Downsides sometimes, that personal relationship with Christ, you can kind of lose it because you're caught up in the communities.
So you grew up in the faith, you grew up here,
yeah.
But you went to school in Mexico too?
Yes. So I grew up here in Los Angeles and grew up with my Catholic parents. Decent family. We're 5 kids, and at home, we would be speaking Spanish. That was our first language growing up. We didn't start speaking English until we started heading off to school. My parents brought us in a Catholic school, and our faith was deeply involved in that manner. Besides going to your Sunday masses, we'd be praying the rosary before going to sleep every day. Faith was lived in that way. Something very important that I hadn't realized until later was the act of blessing. Before we'd head off on our own, now a little more common, you would receive your parents' blessing. Your father and your mother. I really appreciated having that now. So anyways, I grew up in the faith here in the U.S. So a little ways from my roots there in Mexico. My mom is from the north, a little state called Chihuahua, and my dad is a little further south. He's in a little state called San Luis Potosí. And they didn't meet each other until they were here. Their story of coming to the U.S., looking for a better life, I carry that with me. And I had the privilege of going back down to Mexico for my high school. So that secondhand experience of Mexican culture, I also had that firsthand of being there. And I think that's an insight. You can usually, it's common to go to Mexico every once in a while to visit family, but that normally doesn't last any more than a month. I was in Mexico for 3 years, so I was able to get the lay of the land, as you say.
That's so cool that you have kind of this multiple experiences of the church. In our pre-interview, you were talking about how when you think of like your heart's prayers, it's in Spanish. I've heard even people on staff here grew up with Mass in Spanish, the church in Spanish. It was just so deeply part of the family culture to experience the faith in Spanish, which I think is so beautiful. But as you said, you were raised here, and I think even you have tasted the global Catholic Church in different ways, maybe through your formation and things like that.
Definitely. I mean, the most recent would be, as you mentioned, the National Eucharistic Congress, just a sample of the states in Indianapolis. That was my first time out there, but I think because we're going with the entirety of the church, I felt really at home. But, outside of that experience of the Universal Church, little samplings here and there for a brief period of time. It was around 10 years. I was with the Legionaries of Christ in religious life, something I deeply appreciated and wouldn't have had if my parents didn't open up and let me go ahead and pursue that. I started young. I started around 12. So what would be late middle school, what was called an apostolic school. It's essentially young high school guys thinking about the priesthood and very interested in the priesthood with that specific congregation. And part of my discernment, and not just discernment for my calling as a priesthood religious life, it's also the personal calling. You spoke a lot, in the last recording with Shoban, that multifaceted calling of who you are. And that I found that very, very beautiful. I find it difficult sometimes because you're dealing with what you feel you're called to, and you can be pulled in so many directions. And I think that's just a beautiful way of expressing that, tied with who you are, your calling. You don't know where to go and what to do if you don't know who you are. And I think that's something I had struggled with a little bit, at least at the beginning, not just in my calling to the priesthood, but it was also calling of what God really wants in my life. It's not a set path, but rather a path that you're walking with Him. When we say He's the way, the truth, and the life, I thought the way because He's the destination, but no, He's there beside you, and that's what matters. That deep relationship with Him. So I discerned out of the Legion back in 2020, mid-pandemic, and I did feel a little lost at the beginning, but thankfully with accompaniment and just, to be honest, beautiful friendships, I was able to find beautiful groups that were able to accompany me and really finding my footing as well. I think it's beautiful because it's kind of expressed in different ways. I think my journey of faith is very intertwined with my calling. And it's a personal calling that we're all trying to figure out, and to the best of our abilities.
And as you said, there's this together element in the Olympic model: faster, higher, stronger, together. And you talking about the community element, even in the beginning, mentioning after COVID, we were used to this more digital platforms and digital small groups and things like that. But there's something nice about being together. And of course, like you said, living the faith together. There's many ways that that's expressed. And I think seeing the universal church, as you said, lived out too. It's not just on a holy card or in a beautiful painting. It's not this two-dimensional thing. It's like a lived out thing, 3D, in the flesh, in the world, visible. You can capture it with all of the senses. So that's kind of what we're here to talk about today, to talk about in this little series. Even in the pre-interview, I learned so much. So I know it's a long history of the church in Mexico.
We'll try to do it justice.
Let's see if you can abbreviate it. Assuming the listener has never known anything about the church in Mexico, what is the Catholic identity and how does that play out in Mexican history?
I thank you. All right. Well, I'll try to do it justice, but I mean, there's so many resources. But I think we can start with our provenance, right? If you look at American history, England, right? You have to mention that. And for us in Mexico, right? Spain is definitely an influence, and it's definitely a provenance, right? As much as the Aztecs and the Mayans. Starting in Spain, we're talking about Renaissance time. So this is like the 1400s, right? During this time, there's this big push, right? To go out, find new lands, right? What is forgotten at times, that this push is, you might say political, you might just go for land, but there is also a deep desire to spread that faith. We're talking about a Spain coming out of being conquered or being threatened by the Moors, right? It was a time where that was cleared out, and there's this fervor, and part of that fervor is for both, queen and king, for that royalty, but also to spread the faith. When I don't know if you've ever played sports. You're really in the zone. You want to, keep going, right? And I think that was sort of the spirit of adventure. So that spread. There's already this intense devotion. So they start exploring, and the first ones that come into contact, right, with the natives, there comes this attitude of bringing, yes, maybe the land, but also bringing our faith. I think people forget that accompanying all these so-called conquerors, right, are religious, Franciscans, priests that want to spread the faith, right? The human condition is where there's going to be conflict, right? There's original sin. Even from the very beginning, Cain and Abel, brothers, people who are super close can be so divided, let alone people who don't know too much about each other. So Spain comes, and there's an attempt at also bringing the faith. And there's practices there that the Aztecs had, besides the beautiful diversity there. There were practices that are objectively against human dignity, human sacrifice, for one, right? That offense against the dignity of human life. Obviously, that's something that goes against what we believe, what the Spaniards are trying to bring. Now, in that conquering, right, it's not like it was just one people there in Mexico at the time. there were a lot of other small tribes. I mean, there's even in Mexico, I mentioned the big ones, right? The Aztecs, the Mayans, but there are the Olmecas, right? Every region had their own tribe. And of course, the smaller tribes are going to want to one up the big dominating tribe, right? The ones that kind of started joining the Spaniards first on their conquista were these smaller tribes. Now, in the midst of all that, there's also difficulties in translation, in communication, but slowly things are being learned. It's not just you come and speak our language or else. There's a learning on both sides. Regardless, they come to what would be now Mexico City, the capital of the Aztecs at the time. And there is what ends up being overthrowing, right? Beautiful things as well, just the amount of architecture there in Mexico City itself. It's built on a lake. So this is beautiful. There's an exchange between the two peoples and conflict due to prophecies and of the native Aztecs at the time, right? Some would view them as saviors and others as not quite saviors. Because of the technological advancements, right? Spain ends up conquering Mexico, which at the time started there in Mexico City, but it spread to, it would include a big chunk of America now. It goes up to California, Arizona, New Mexico, Oregon, Nevada. It was a very big region, and it goes further down as well. Claimed in the name of Spain and the name of the faith. Now, at the beginning, there's a lot of difficulty, right, in that transmission of faith, because there are bad examples, right? You say to live the faith, you say to live a moral life, and you're here also not doing that. I think that's always a dilemma of our faith as well. We're both, the church is what? Saint and sinner. Does that mean we're all bad? No, it's we're still called to sanctity even amidst all the scandals. But because of that, a lot of the natives didn't really want to convert, right? So something needed to be done. And something was done. Our Lady, our Blessed Mother, came herself. We know the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe, right? Who appeared to an indigenous man, Juan Diego. Juan Diego was the name that he took on, right? He had a different name before. He had a native name. She appears to a humble Indian, right? And poor guy, he was a very devoted man, but he was just trying to get to his work, get to his job, right? Live his daily life. And he recognized her, right? And over the course of a couple apparitions, she asked Juan Diego to ask the bishop at the time, who was Spaniard, to create a basilica, right? Create a church there for her. Well, there's an initial resistance. There's a healthy dose of skepticism in the church, right? The church takes a long time to approve apparitions. And well, obviously, when you hear someone saying, Our Blessed Mother appeared to me. So he sent him away several times. But finally, Our Lady said, I'm going to create a little sign for you so that he can proceed with this. Okay. I mean, there's a little miracle at the time. She asked him to pick a certain type of flower. That wasn't very common at that period of time. This is mid-December, and this flower wouldn't appear until like May. But there it was. He picked the flowers, brought them to Our Lady, and she arranged them in his tilma, right? A tilma is basically just big garment cloth that they'd lay in front of them. And they tend to be dirty. They tend to dissolve, and their max lifespan is like 30 years or something. Kind of a brittle material. Regardless, she arranges it there, and he reveals it to the bishop. And on that tilma, an image of Our Lady appears. And there's so many details in that tilma alone. Oh, no expert. There are books written. But every little detail, the arrangement of the stars, the fact that she's pregnant, the different colors, and the fact that she's mestiza. There's a lot of mestizos at the time, that is born of a Spaniard parent and an indigenous parent, right? These were people that are already kind of cast aside because you're neither one nor the other. You're this weird thing. But there she is. And it resonated on both sides. Why? Because it's Our Lady who appeared. And for a lot of the indigenous at the time, right, there was this figure called Tonantzin, which was this well, for them goddess, but this motherly figure. So immediately there's a connection there. Mary decided to come to a period that was difficult, having a lot of stressful times, and she wanted to be with us. There's one phrase that she said to Juan Diego, am I not here who am your mother? No soy aquí que soy tu madre. The love of a mother, you can't say no to that. Christ couldn't say no to her. And neither could the bishop. He constructed the basilica. That tilma he had, it's still there. I don't know how many years later, right? This happened in the 1500s or so. It's already 400 years. And it's one of the most attended pilgrimage sites in the world, and intense pilgrimages that would go from, even in Mexico itself, you start from the remotest regions and you would walk all the way to the area, and in that last stretch, that last mile, you get on your knees and you make that final procession. I've had the privilege of being there once when I was in Mexico for those 3 years. I was in Guadalajara, so Mexico City is like 2-3 hours from that. There's an intense fervor, very devoted people. She's not only the patroness of Mexico, but all the Americas and the Philippines, right? It's very, very personal. She decides to appear as us. And I think it's a beautiful way of how the church likes to act. It's the art of enculturation, right? You're bringing the beautiful elements of a culture and just highlighting that, and what's not of the faith and very harmful that comes from the culture. That's what we want to try to sift out. And that's what was attempted there. And that's what I think Our Lady continues to do. Anyways, this is the first part of Mexico, right? It was New Spain at the time, right? So it wasn't exactly Mexico already instituted, but it's that new people. That's something very particular when two cultures almost diametrically opposed to come to each other. There's more of a separation, right? Kind of the ghettoing, right? Where you separate yourselves and there's contact, no attempt at a communication. And I think Our Lady saw that and wanted all her children to be there with us. So that's Our Lady of Guadalupe. And from that sparked so many saints already. Earlier in that time, there's San Felipe de Jesús, I think his actual name is San Felipe de las Casas Martínez. He's a priest of the Franciscans, late 1500s, and early church. And it's funny, you're just evangelized and you decide to go evangelize. So him and a couple of his Franciscans go out to Nagasaki in Japan, right? And they spread the faith. The only issue was, at the time, I think Japan was really against foreigners. Like, they didn't really want anything to do with it because it was an external influence. They ended up getting martyred. Pretty gruesome martyrdom. They're all crucified. All sorts of ingenious tortures. But how is it that a nation that's barely birthed, not even birthed, with the faith, and there's already this intense, beautiful desire to evangelize? Anyways, this is the early period. Go on a little later, fast forward, say 200 years, 1800s or so. And what happens is Spain as a superpower starts waning. There comes a point in time where Spain can no longer hold the Mexican territories. So after a couple revolutions, basically, Mexico ends up becoming its own people, right? And I think some people don't exactly know. Some of the revolutionaries are priests, right? If you look at Mexican currency, right, los pesos, sometimes you see random people on there. You have a random nun on there. So Juana de Inés, she was a big advocate for women's rights, the fact that they're able to write. Right. And one of the early revolutionaries, Jose Maria Morelos, he's also one of the, I think if you listen to it in today's culture, it's kind of, what? He was a Catholic priest, he was a statesman and a military leader.
Wow.
You don't really have these things cross nowadays, right? But there's a desire of having our own nation. We still carry on a lot of that beautiful faith. It was already seeped deep into I think the Mexican culture and psyche. Regardless, Mexico becomes its own nation. Time goes on, and we're talking late 1800s. Every country has its own revolutions, and there was a fair amount of civil war in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
It can be pretty confusing at times. So many different parties vying for control, and it's kind of hard to keep track. But regardless, at the end of this, a regime came about that was very anti-clerical, right? That is, against the church and the values of the church. Now, this wasn't a general trend in the people. It was more of agenda from a few select politicians. So laws were instituted, but because the faith was kind of very strongly in amongst the people, it wasn't really enforced. Fast forward a couple years, though, and a guy named Plutarco Elias Calles takes the presidency, and his regime, he did institute a couple more laws, and he really hammered down. These were called the Calles laws. And we're talking laws that say you can't go to mass, priests can't wear their clerical garb, you can't even gather, and the majority of what would be things that are owned by the church, so churches themselves, as well as houses that bishops would have, those were confiscated and given back to the government. So at this point, they started sending soldiers to enforce these laws. Now, a lot of this upheaval was kind of toward the center of Mexico. So the hotspots were the states of Jalisco, Michoacan. There was conflict in the rest, but it was mainly this area there. And when you have a dictatorship, right, an oppression like that, how do you react? We have something in the catechism that's called the just law for war. As in, when is it just for a war to be waged, right? There has to be a motive. All the other recourses have already been taken up. And I think this Cristero War, right, named after the Cristeros, those who would believe in Christ and would fight against a society or an oppression of faith, of one of the very few instances where I think it was justified. Now, I say that now and afterwards, right, a couple hundred years. In the moment, you wouldn't even know. Right. One of those laws also was to exile foreigners, right? And a lot of religious that would come, priests, so they were all kicked out. The response would be, first, there were a couple saints already that would write articles in newspapers that would kind of give their reasonings as to why these laws are unjust, right? That freedom of speech. And so there's a initial pacifism. There were some individuals that say, well, we don't really want to resist with arms, and we can only passively resist. So there were Catholics and Christians that wasn't always the case, right? There were couples that, okay, the only way to actually defend ourselves is to take up arms. So Cristeros, I have a book where a lot of these details are explained. It's called Entre los patas de los caballos, Diario de un Cristero by Luis Rivero del Val. And it's a book that's basically you're amongst the feet of horses, right? What does that mean? As in, hey, you're being trampled. It's the diary of a Cristero, right? So it would go through all these things, and if you ever get the chance to read it, it would talk about the difficulty trying to find a mass, to be able to get a priest, sneak a priest in for mass. As soon as you find out you're going to have mass, you would fast, right? Confession. There was an attempt at a sacramental life even when priests were outlawed, and really hard to find them, and they'd be killed on the spot if they'd find them. It would relate as well with that conflict with a lot of the federales, right? These government soldiers. Old churches would be taken down, desecrated by the soldiers. A lot of stuff that I don't even want to say here, but
there's a movie about this.
And there's indeed a movie about this. Thank you. Yeah. It's called For Greater Glory. I love how it depicts it in a very succinct way. That shows kind of the realistic horrors of what you have to go through. And the majority were already, older men, but there are also brigades of women that would help bring them bullets, clean, bring the faith in their own homes whenever possible. That value of family was still there. One such Cristero, little Cristero, is a guy named Jose Luis Sanchez del Rio. Right. This is a 14-year-old boy who said, I want to join my brother. I want to join the Cristeros. 14? It's barely even high school. And you have that passion. And there's this phrase that they would say, Viva Cristo Rey. Viva la Virgen de Guadalupe. You can try to translate it as Long Live Christ the King, but something about viva, right? It's vivacious, right? It's from the inside. Christ who was, who is, and will be. And, this is even outside of... Even later, you can hear it, que viva, right? It's very common and still utilized. Anyways, so this 14-year-old boy who's with the Cristeros ends up being captured, imprisoned. And there's one small story where, besides the stuff that they do to him, he'd be imprisoned in a church. And he'd witness a lot of these sacrilegious acts that would happen. At one point, I think the soldiers took the consecrated host and just scattered them about, and chickens were up and about. So he was able to sneak out and consume the host he could before he was caught and put back in the cell. He would be called Little Tarcisio. Tarcissus was a saint who was martyred. This is back in Rome in the 300s or something like that, early church. And he had this immense devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and would do something very similar. So he was called that because of that gesture. Regardless, San Jose Luis Sanchez del Rio is captured, tortured. They'd have him walk on stones, but they'd cut the soles of his feet, and he'd walk on these sharp stones. And this was on the way to his grave. He had to dig on his own for himself. Before he died, he'd utter that cry, because it's a real cry, right? Viva Cristo Rey. That was what you'd say, el lema, right? That was the motto that would be utilized by all the Cristeros right before they're shot. Wish I was able to do that 14 years old. How that conflict ends up being resolved, I think there's an American that comes by, all this war isn't good for business. So we tried to create a peace. There was an agreement, and the Cristeros would hand over their weapons, and there'll be no longer persecutions, and these laws would be tolerated a little bit more. Even that, Cristeros would hand over their rifles, and then the soldiers would turn around and shoot them. Right. So there was still little pockets of resistance until that sort of died down. Luckily, new regimes come to power, right? So a lot of these things end up pattering out. But when a faith is persecuted, when blood of martyrs are spilt, hence the seed of Christians.
Tertullian.
Thank you. Yeah.
Good reference.
I mean, it seeped in, I want to think, to our earth, to the people, to Mexicans. You go to towns in Mexico and you'd be like, oh yeah, he was martyred here. I was able to experience that when I was in Mexico with different pilgrimage sites. Where I was situated in Guadalajara, it's kind of there was a lot of stuff in that area. A fervor continues, right? It isn't lost.
Before we move to the contemporary, though, I'm already seeing some things that I just want to highlight for the listener.
Of course.
Starting back all the way to Our Lady of Guadalupe, when you mentioned this mestiza version of her, she appears looking like the people. This is a story that I've heard before.
Yeah.
Oftentimes you hear like a very condensed version from the pulpit on December 12th. People always speak about it and give like a little history lesson, but to hear it in the context that you're saying, it's funny researching church history through these conversations because I was never interested in history, but history gives us the situation of the church at the time. And so it makes the story more meaningful. Because you see why it was important for her to appear. And even whenever you mentioned that she was looking like all the people, like this is kind of a new country, you said in our pre-interview, like a fusion of people coming together. Like that even gave great personal relevance, I feel, because like you're a Mexican American, I'm a Filipino American, and that Mary is all things to all people. She is all of our mother. And I know we're separating it by culture and country too, but like, this is our church history. One of the other presenters in this series was saying finding out about the saints is to expand your own family tree. And I think that's a great way to experience what we're learning about. When you're saying this, like, sure, I'm not Mexican, but I am Catholic, and this is my history too.
Right.
And it's really interesting, especially since Mexico is a so much older country than the U.S. Spain, England, those European countries, way older than the U.S. But especially in the lens of the church, like this is our history. It is good for us to understand these contexts. So Our Lady appearing to us, looking like us, because she's our mother. Like that's so beautiful. Even what you're sharing about Juan Diego, like I didn't know he was sent away so many times, but he persisted. Like that's a great thing to be highlighted, that the church is slow. The church takes time. And like you said, healthy level of skepticism, but he was perseverant in it. Like Mary kept appearing to him, and it wasn't until several times later that she was like, okay, I'll give you a little sign to give to the bishop. And like that's where the bishop was able to hear what Mary was trying to say. The result of so many people listening to Our Lady is why that's a great pilgrimage site. That's a place that edifies the church all these hundreds of years later. So to the point, like you said, of the fervor of like being on your knees for a mile. Some people can't even be on their knees like a little bit after communion. You know what I mean? But gosh, the fervor, like you said. And then moving from that first Renaissance area, the New Spain, you would think, oh, we just had this like magical apparition. Like now everyone's going to be converted. And there were literally millions of conversions. She's the face of the new evangelization, right? No, people, we're forgetful. We're a forgetful church. We're a forgetful church. And so people persecute not long after that. And they're literally martyring people for the faith. Not too long after. We're a forgetful people. That's what I gained from that.
Yeah. In that sense, it resembles the people of Israel. In the book of Judges, there's a cycle of we're good with God. We sin. We forget God. It's not adoring other gods. You're taken over by an external power. You cry out to help for God. He comes in. He sends somebody. We're good. We're back with God again. And now
the cycle continues.
The cycle continues, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, hundreds of years sounds like a lot. Really, in the lens of the church, we should look at centuries like decades. Like we really can. We have the perspective. There's this longevity of the church, and the life of the church has persisted 2,000 years after Jesus. Katie Austin, in one of the other episodes, she was saying like, yeah, it feels like, oh, the 1800s, olden times. No, that's only 200 years in the eyes of God, So it's to like kind of expand the purview. Maybe it's intense because it's like, I can't learn everything. And maybe that is intense for people, but I think it's fascinating to kind of open the mind and say, hey, this is my history. The 1200s are my history. All of it is ours. Like, and to claim that identity as a Catholic. a Catholic Christian. Like Christians talk about the early church fathers and everything too. So love the battle cry of Viva Cristo Rey. You're right, at World Youth Day, by the way, they still use it frequently. You always hear that in the crowds with the millions, and everyone knows how to respond to that, by the way. Like if someone says Viva, you know what to say next. Sometimes it's Viva Papa, like we're with the Pope too, but people know how to respond when they say Viva. And the witness of a 14-year-old boy getting his feet, having him walk to his grave that he digs and like announce your faith. And at 14 to have the courage, that spiritual fortitude, what we're talking about, the saints have this Olympian spirit of the heart, Olympian spirit of the soul, that they say Viva. That's ultimate Olympian, right? That he's responding to that, and that being birthplace of new life, a new chapter in the church. So as we move forward into the contemporaries, into this part 3 of Mexican history, such a rich history here, which, as you said, there are books, there's so many more things to know. This is even just a snapshot, but I've heard priests say, well, they just started wearing their clerics in Mexico because of the history. And now that you're saying it, I'm like, so it's not common for priests to wear clerics in Mexico because that's the history.
So that persecution, to be honest, that law was just repealed recently in like the early 2000s.
Wow.
Literally in our century. Those effects are still there, right? The remnants of a passionate love for Christ, a passionate love for the church. I think that kind of resounded. St. John Paul II, great saint. When he would come in Mexico to visit Our Lady of Guadalupe, there was a real kinship. I think it was the first place he visited after becoming Pope. I think us in Mexico is kind of adopted, hence the cry Viva el Papa, I'm trying to even get cariño, intimate relationship, I think, between the people and the Pope. But yeah, that continues on in modern times. And on a personal basis for me, growing up with the Legion, we would study a lot of that history because it started in 40 something. We'd have the remnants of that passion for Christ, that love for Christ, that cry. So the roots being traced back, to the Cristeros themselves, that love for Christ. So I hadn't really made too much of that connection, but because the Legion was started in Mexico, it started from that root. So there's still saints very close to our time. Vatican II was a very momentous occasion for the church in all regards and aspects, right? And this attempt at, giving the laity their place. Right. And it was around this time, a little bit before, was a Mexican laywoman called Maria Concepcion Cabrera de Hermida, or Conchita Hermida. She's from San Luis Potosí, kind of where my dad is. She was already presenting all these ideas about taking that upon ourselves, making that our own. She was beatified in 2019. Hopefully she's canonized. But there's remnants even now. There's a calling for holiness that's still there. And I think as beautiful as Mexico is as a country, as a people, there's still a lot of remnants of sin, of conflict, of difficulty. Our Lady, she appeared as pregnant. This desire to protect life because of how horribly it was being treated through human sacrifices at the time, right? And I mean, modern day too, abortion, definitely one of them. Sadly, all the drug cartels and everything that occurs there as well. Those the strong offenses toward life, and we as a people have to work on and really pray. And Our Lady does want that life to be protected.
That's been the surprising thing as this series has been unfolding. The dignity of life, which feels like an obvious, almost like a vanilla thing to talk about as a Catholic, but that has come up in every single episode thus far that I've recorded, and it's so cool to me because I used to work in the pro-life movement. So I know it's very important to me because that was my career for 3.5 years, talking about abortion. But it is interesting how like that is so coupled with who the identity of the church is. And yes, there's different like expressions of it, but there's also specific violations of life in different parts of the world based on the culture and upbringing. So it's interesting that you're saying that, like, that it seems you're also on theme with what the other presenters are saying, who I don't think you've heard any of the other presenters except Siobhan, because that's the only one released at the moment of recording. We are called to be saints in all stages of life, in all decades, in every season, in every culture. And there's specific ways that we have to respond to the violations of our time. And our Lord teaches us what it means to love our neighbor whenever we don't dignify others. There's just like there's many different ways to say yes, there's many different ways to say no to God. I guess I'm just realizing it now as more recordings have passed. That's keeps coming up. So I love that. You're talking about the specific violations against life, and some of them are like everywhere. Abortion, that's everywhere, right? Maybe not in Poland. I think in Poland, abortion is unthinkable. At least that's what I heard when I went there.
I mean,
in 2016.
If you go to those pueblitos, right? That's still unheard of, right? The whole town shuts down for Holy Week.
Yeah.
But sadly, no, that does seep in from other countries, from the external. As beautiful as the United States is, sometimes the policies that are spread aren't the best. Abortion is definitely one of them.
Yeah. So in your pre-interview, you talked about a special cross, and it's got this personal relevance to you as a Mexican American. Can you talk about that?
At home, me growing up, our home, right? You decorate it the way you see fit. There was this cross there, and as a kid, I was like, oh, that's a weird cross. Just because it's, it was like already old, and when I was small, I didn't really understand. So it was a little later when I started asking, is there a history to that? Why do we even have this, right? Who gave it to us? Me thinking they got it from like a store or something. It's like, no, actually, let me tell you a story. And it turns out this cross is an old cross that, what's the Spaniard cross? So it's like wider, of the old Spanish style. And it was a cross that a priest who was being persecuted gave to my family. This was in the middle of the Cristero War, and they gave it to our family. And at that time we weren't supposed to have any of that up because you'd be persecuted. So it was hidden, right? And it was kept and just passed down, and now we're the ones that have it. So, and given that, once I come to realize church history, my Mexican identity, and my personal family identity is already there. And I think it's just our Lord saying, don't forget where you're coming from. Ultimately, we're coming from God, right? We come from him. And then we're handed on. We have the history of the generations, right? Our first fathers, and what in our immediate memory are our family. And I think that's beautiful. I think it's something I need to learn to cherish more. Being in the U.S., we're caught up in a lot of individualism and materialism. And I didn't really think about it too much. You just go about your daily life. But at a certain point, it's, wait a second, there are other values here that I'm missing. There's that sense of community that I get from my family, from my Mexican heritage. Family, very important. And learn to let go a little bit of the things. Maybe we're not the best off economically, but when it comes to celebration of family, we're all in, we all pitch in, we throw a big party, una fiestona, to celebrate. And I think that's beautiful to have. Living in the church is also a joy. And I think that's something that I'm left with every day. And that's something I want to integrate more into my life.
Yeah. I love this sacramental, I'm going to call it like lowercase s, sacramental of the cross that was given by this priest during that time, that it's passed down. It's like a physical representation of what church identity is, what it means to be a member of the family of the church, that there's now that you have a physical aspect of it, but through the gift of technology, you're passing it to us, you're passing it to the listener in a way, because we have to claim the heritage. Yeah. Like this is all part of our church family. This is expanding our family tree. And you're right, like there is a beautiful community element that you see in Mexican culture. I've only lived in LA for 4 years. And that was super clear from day one, right? And all these beautiful traditions, Guadalupanos, huge ministry of the parish. I just want to tell like one little story about the Guadalupanos and the Filipinos, actually. Both of those ministries, we had a priest here at this parish. A little over a year ago now, he was ordained. And so we had the reception here. And it was like a wedding reception because it was his great consecration day, right? He was ordained a priest of Jesus Christ. And I had expected a certain number of people, and really 2 or 3 times more than those people showed up. And it was the Guadalupanos and the Filipinos that provided all the food. And I was like, I think we're going to run out. And both groups kind of looked at me like, no. I said, I was ready for like, 100, and there's like maybe 600, 700 people here.
Oh, wow.
And they're like, we're good. And no doubt. They're like, we showed up. We knew what to expect. We provided. It's not a big deal. We're here to celebrate. We know how to do that. And it's because of that community element. I really feel like they're interdependent culture versus our American, independent culture. So, I mean, there is a great beauty of that. And for me, that's the grace of being bicultural, having the Cajuns, which also would show up, by the way. If they were here, they would have showed up with the gumbo or whatever, seafood. So they have that interdependent family relationship that, yeah, can be missing in certain parts of the world and in the West, especially maybe here in the US. So how being Mexican, how your family heritage shaped your intellect, shaped your heart, and shaped your faith. Like, it's a gift. Like, and I think we all probably can learn how to appreciate how the church was presented to us, especially when it's passed down through the family. So thank you for sharing that. Is there anything you want to say in closing before we go about the saints, favorite saint, your culture, your heritage, anything, any closing words?
I think a faith that's lived, that's lively, that's the only way to be able to spread our faith. And I think my faith, as much as I like to study it intellectually, right? It's a faith that's lived. And when I pray, when I study the faith, I do it in English. When I pray, my relationship with God, that's in Spanish. I think our Lord, He showers us with those gifts that are very personal or part of a culture. They all come from Him, the gift of Himself in the Eucharist. That stayed with me ever since, yes, the Congress, but even a little before that, to be able to receive Him and also be receiving the church and realizing that we're not on our own. We're with Him. We're with each other. And someday we'll go back to Him. I think heaven will be a big family reunion. And I think that's something that we can still have and we can start living now.
Just like you said, viva.
Viva. Viva Cristo Rey.
Comes from the vivir, right? To live. Well, thank you, Jesus. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing this great wealth of Mexican history in three parts. Pleasure. And then the lives of the saints, the in-depth story of Our Lady of Guadalupe. What a gift. Thank you for being here.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Can you close us with a glory be in Spanish?
For sure. En nombre del Padre, del Hijo, del Espíritu Santo. Amén. Gloria al Padre, y al Hijo, y al Espíritu Santo, como era en el principio, ahora y siempre, por los siglos de los siglos. Amén.
Thanks, Jesus.
Thank you.